with all of that covered, we will now get to our main topic today here on Mastering Dungeons. We are looking at part 2 of chapter 5 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. This is on adventure environments, the wilderness. As you well know, if you are a full-time listener here, we are covering the Dungeon Master's Guide from cover to cover to look at the 2014 version and talk about what we might see in the 2024 version of the Dungeon Master's Guide, as Teos shows us his spokesmodel career in full steam, showing you the book.
I can't
That's
even.
right.
I'm terrible at
So,
it.
yeah. Mm-hmm. So last time, like I said, we talked about the first part of chapter 5, which talked about creating your dungeons, the dungeon environment. Now we are getting into part 2, which is the wilderness environment. And yeah, let's start by saying what they say. Between the dungeons and settlements of your campaign world lie meadows, forests, deserts, mountain ranges, oceans, and other tracts of wilderness waiting to be traversed. Bringing wilderness areas to life can be a fun part of your game, but for you and your players, both for you and your players. The following 2 approaches work particularly well, and they give us 2 approaches to wilderness travel. They give us the travel montage, and they give us the hour-by-hour approach. So, Teos, I'm going to take a little sip here,
Sure.
and I'm going to let you give your thoughts on this so far.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think these are generally solid. Like, I love this chapter because it's packed full of information, and the information is all good. Um, I think that so they talk about the travel montage approach, and the idea is here you're kind of just going through and saying what happened. You're not playing it out. You're not doing details. You're just sort of saying what happened. And they say the good piece of advice they give is don't just say, nothing happened as you walked through this area. You covered 20 miles, nothing happened. Don't say that. Instead, talk about the waterfall that you saw and the strange rock formation and a few other details to make it interesting. And that's great. Um, and they talk about using the landscape to set mood and tone, some pieces like that. I think that's all decent. Um, I think that it could be a little more what I don't and then they say the hour by hour approach, which is like um you're gonna go through and probably have encounters and you're gonna have a marching order and you're gonna play things out. Uh Again, good advice. It doesn't really tell me why I'm using one approach or the other, and what specifically to expect to do with these, how to make them better, what pitfalls are there. And I just kind of think, Shawn, that in today's world, as much as I like reading all this text, I don't know that everybody does, especially newer readers, younger readers, and whether it should be a little more, again, how-to based and tip based here. What do you think?
At first blush, this travel montage suggestion seems perfectly like a no-brainer. This seems like the perfect way to do it. And I can see how that might seem true. In practice, often it doesn't add enough to the game to make it worthwhile. I see it as in American literature, the old Hemingway versus Faulkner dichotomy. Do you use the least amount of words possible to reach your goal, or the most amount of words possible to create the experience, to elicit the feelings and tell the story that you're trying to tell? Both are okay, but what is the goal? With Hemingway, the goal is to hit that emotional hard with the most in the tersest way possible.
Mm.
With Faulkner, it's to tell it in the most elaborate, strange, roundabout way, where you are on a roller coaster and you hopefully will enjoy the ride and find that thread that gets to where you're going, right? The chapter in As I Lie Dying where it says my mother is a fish. And it's so strange, and and all it's saying is the mother's dead and the little kid doesn't understand what's going on, but they drilled a hole in the coffin and so therefore he thinks that it's like it's this strange child's logic to try to figure out the child's interpretation of what's happening.
Yeah.
Uh, so this is like that. It's also the box text problem of what do you need to tell. So the way I see this is the players know that they're marching from here to there, and they're going to fight the Lich in the Lich's tower. So do you say you leave the town, you are at the Lich's tower, or do you give some dialogue, some description as they travel? And for my class and in blogs, I have put up here's a description of this box text that describes your journey, which is exactly what this is telling you to
Mm-hmm.
do. And as I teach or as I discuss it, we will discuss the finer points of this word versus that word, or should you do this or should you do that? And a lot of people read that box text and they say, yeah, it's fine. That's good. It's cool. It's very evocative. I understand it. But then as we pick it apart, as we say, do you really need to say this? Do you really? Some people come to the conclusion now, I'd rather have you just say, and you're at the Lich's Tower.
Mm.
Neither is right, neither is wrong. Both of them are ways that you could handle things. But it goes back to the point I was talking about in our listener corner, which is sometimes people, when they hear a description, want it to be important. They want it to have a bigger meaning than just there. So the one example from the book from the DMG was the halfling finds a stone that looks like something.
It's a weird example.
If for many of my players, as you read it, you're like, okay, yeah, that's cool. It's a kind of a neat little thing. Well, for many of my players that I've had, I'm going to be spending the next half hour talking about that stone. Unless I literally say the stone means nothing. It's just a stone, which defeats the purpose of using it in the first place. Because the players, I cast detect magic on the stone. Well, you don't need to because it's not magical. Well, I make a history check? Do I, right? It turns into this thing that's bigger. And in the end, it can spur a good story,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to then work toward that, which
Yeah.
some people love to do and some people don't want to do. Or you're disappointing the player by saying, yeah, it's just a stone.
It doesn't even
Well, why
exist.
did you
You
tell
don't
me
even
about the
have
stone
it.
in the
Yeah.
first place?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where I would like to step back and think of this differently, right? In that when I'm creating a travel montage, either in my campaign or for written work, I'm
Mhm.
looking at what are the story beats, what is the story arc that's in play, what should
Mhm.
fill the space here, right? There is a void that we must fill. So we need to
Mhm.
paint the canvas a certain way to establish whatever it is that's going to happen. If the wilderness matters, then things must happen in some way. Or if
Mhm.
characterizing the wilderness, it all should matter, then we must characterize in a certain way. And so it's one of the things that I don't like about
Mhm.
what's set up here and in the ensuing sections is there an assumption that you can just do whatever? You can just chuck in a monument, you can just describe a waterfall, you can do whatever. But you should think about what the setting is like and then model it accordingly. Because if the area is really dry, then there is no waterfall and should not be, right? If it's not
Mhm.
swampy, there's no
Yeah.
quicksand, if there, and so on. Um, and that's where what I really think the benefit, when I've played great games involving overland travel, it's because every scene that was described helped me understand the nature of the world that was in and fed
Mhm.
into the overall campaign and so on, right? Like if this is like in Cholt, right, which is probably one of the ones that folks understand the best through Tomb of Annihilation, you are expecting an inhospitable jungle. So you want to have
Mhm.
encounters with dinosaurs. If you hand wave all the travel and nobody meets any of these dangers, it won't make sense. It needs to have this feeling of
Mhm.
hazards. There should be the undead in the undead region, and the dinosaurs should happen, and there should be some difficulty of moving through this moist, jungly landscape. because that then creates that expression and that feeling and that experience
Mhm.
that's so important to the overall play, right?
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And I think that's what you think about when you do your travel montage is not only what is the atmosphere, what's that I'm trying to convey, but what clues, even if they're just very vague and evocative of a mood or a type of thing. We go back to Edgar Allan Poe's Unity of Effect. If
Mhm.
the first thing that the characters hit when they go toward the Lich's Tower is a trap that shoots out poison, maybe describe the poisonous vapors coming off the plants throughout the forest as they come here. That puts poison in their mind. And so when the poison trap goes off, even if they don't go, aha, poison plus poison,
Right.
at least there's that little part of their brain where poison makes sense
Yeah.
here. So that's one way you can use this travel montage to do more than one thing,
Yeah.
have more than one purpose to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like in Tomb of Annihilation when you go through all these dangers and then you reach the camp and you might end up at the camp that has been destroyed that was a Order of the Gauntlet camp. Uh, well, now it makes sense. This is so dangerous this camp fell apart. Or you reach the next camp they have and it's under all of this pressure and could fall without your help, and that all makes sense because of the things you've gone through, right? Like that's it creates that
Mhm.
really great feeling that ties it all together and it feels cohesive. And if you were to hand wave that without proper attention, you wouldn't experience it, right? And that's where I think between these two approaches, there should be better instruction here as to how to choose. It's fine to have these two approaches; they're good approaches,
Yeah.
but you want to know why you're doing it and what the goals are of all this, right? What are the goals for your travel? Like start with the
Mhm.
questions, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah. And again, this is talking about moving from one place to another where you know you're going. To me, this doesn't even start to address the hex crawl sort of
Mhm.
game that one might
Right.
play, where the travel is the goal, not the means to get to your goal. And that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, and that we'll talk
Then we
about
get
that
to a
as we have in
section.
the
Oh,
past when we get to that chapter that covers it, which is part of the problem here is that this, as we talked about in our exploration episodes in 2020, believe it or not, there is a big difference
wow.
between what part of the content is in the player's handbook on how to move around in groups, which they kind of talk about here. Like they'll mention the navigator, but they won't refer you to where to look to find those rules. And then you have the other chapter
Mhm.
that's providing you with actual like sort of hex crawl type information. So it's all split up, which makes it harder to do properly here for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to just sidetrack here in the Ghostfire Gaming book Aurora Age of
Mm,
Desolation. Exploration and travel is a really important linchpin of the game because civilization has collapsed. So there is no place that's safe. You may be in a settlement that seems safe, but before long you're probably going to have to move. So mapping and exploring is the point of the game in a lot of cases. So we've made a very robust system to handle this in a bit of a more gamified way. There's still random tables you can roll, but you know, getting rumors of what might be in the next territory over and then exploring that to see if these rumors or your observations are true and coming across common or uncommon or even secret locations
mm,
and then having to do a goal within those locations to either fortify it or to clear it or to just mark it as avoid at all costs. So then when settlers move in that direction, they know that it's either safe or might be safe or is definitely not safe. So there's this whole and there's sheets, like worksheets that you as the DM can mark off what these things are, how dangerous they are, whether the threat level is raised or lowered thanks to the characters going through there. It's a pretty cool system that we started from this chapter and then moved it into a more gamified and structured way. So if you enjoy that sort of play, Aurora Age of Desolation is now available on drive-through. So you can just search under Ghostfire Gaming Aurora Age of Desolation, and you can check it out.
Fantastic. And yeah, on drive through, huh? That's great.
Mhm. Yep. So what else? The mapping talks about, as Teo said, we talked about all of this already a couple of years ago. So you can go back and listen to those, which will cover all of this more in depth. But we get ways. It tells us that wilderness can be overwhelming. Treat it like it has rails or roads. Uh, Travel naturally favors common approaches and paths. They talk about movement on the map. As soon as I get to this part, my mind starts spinning, and I'm like, I just want to create an adventure and run it. I don't want all of this, uh, unless you're going to tell me exactly how to do it.
Well, and I think that's where again they don't ask, they're not asking questions of the would-be author, of what is, because that's what it starts with. Like, you're going to create a map. What are you trying to accomplish with this map, right? And so
Yeah.
that the movement drives, and they have a good point that's saying, like, you don't have to be overwhelmed, because often there will be an obvious path. There'll be a sort of, the channel between the mountains or whatever. And
Mhm.
that's fair. Plus you can have guides or any number of things, but w- there's just sort of this assumption that you will make a map. And they talk about, often in their examples, a 50-mile area, but they don't really say how big it should be. And then they're just like, hey, here's your movement, which they don't have the movement rules here. Those are elsewhere. But they talk about, you're either using
Right.
a province scale for hour by hour approach, which I think this is really interesting to tie this into the previous conversation. Hour by hour would go with a province
Mhm.
scale of a hex equals 1 mile. Several days or montage would go with a kingdom scale of a hex equals 6 miles. And we had a whole discussion
Mhm.
about this before on our Patreon Discord. So I kind of raised it again, to especially Graham Ward, who had some thoughts. I'm like, you had some thoughts on this. And he was saying, um, 6 miles per hex works really well because the travel time tables are multiples
Mhm.
of six. You can travel 18, 24, or 30 miles per day based on the pace. So 3 miles or 6 miles to hex works really well. But he points out that Wizards of the Coast adventures, despite this 1 or 6 mile example in the DMG, tend to be 5 or 10 miles per hex. And that makes your math very hard because you're moving partly through a hex,
Mhm.
right? So I thought that was an
Yeah.
interesting thing to think about. And I mean, I just don't even know that this is the right, I don't think the right questions are being asked here as to what a DM is trying to take
Mhm.
on. And then we get, I don't know, do you want to say anything, or should we go into wilderness features?
Let's go right into wilderness features. Yeah.
So we get, no wilderness map is complete without a few settlements, strongholds, etc. And usually have a dozen features over an area roughly 50 miles across. And then we just get like lists and tables of these types of features. And I thought these were very interesting features,
Mhm.
Sean.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sort of at a loss as even now as I look about these features. I want to put something cool and evocative to the overall campaign that I'm running. So unless I'm just doing a let's do it now via hex crawl, um, I'm sort of this chapter doesn't do me much good, I
Yeah.
guess is what I'm trying to say. Uh,
Yeah, because these features are monster lairs, monuments, ruins, settlements, strongholds, weird locales. And those are cool things to
mhm.
consider for a map, although they completely lack anything natural, right? Which is really interesting for wilderness features,
Right.
and all of them are like things people made or creatures living there. But also, again, what is the point of your wilderness? What's the story it's making? because those features
Mhm.
need to capture those pieces, right? If you're traveling through, say, from Icewind Dale to some mountain, right? Um,
Mhm.
there aren't a lot of features, and that's sort of the point. But you can establish the story by having a few, one or two things that they encounter along the way, and that creates the interest in the story. But you have to start with what even is the premise. You don't just roll on a monuments table and
Mhm.
chuck it in the middle of this snow between Icewind Dale and one of the mountains, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And part of me says, well, for each of these, at least give a small description so a game master might get, right? We see uh, a wishing well.
Hmm.
Roll 11 of a d20 for weird locales. So you're in Icewind Dale, you're traveling from one of the 10 towns up into the mountains, and there's a wishing well here in the middle of nowhere in the ice. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, give me I want to say, like, okay, give me a little chunk about how could I use this wishing well. And but then later when we talk about settlements, they do that, but it's like drunk people you might find on the street in a settlement, and drunk is one of them. And I'm like, okay. And they're going to give me a further explanation, and it says, you see an intoxicated individual staggering down the road. And I'm like, you have described to me what a drunk is, in your specific terms. That doesn't help me as the game master give that person a story or tell me how it might be cool to interact with that person for the player, regardless of the type of adventure that I'm running.
And in
And
spite of the fact that
it's not there.
Hamlet gives us such a great drunk in its
Mhm.
adventure, right? That
Yeah,
teaches us the
right.
value of what a drunk person can be. What's his name? Otis, right? I think
Yeah.
it's Otis. And that just like
Oh, it's Elmo.
Elmo.
It's
Yeah,
Elmo. His brother's Otis.
brothers
Yeah.
Otis. We should know better that like that's the point is why these things exist on the map, not put a thing on the map. Like I think this is almost I think what it is, because I know they know, right? Like the designers who wrote this know what great play looks like, but I think they're making the assumptions that the DM will do fun things with these and choose the appropriate things and so on. But what ends up feeling is like just put a bunch of candy on your map, and in some generic world that has no verisimilitude.
Mhm.
But that's not what you want, right? You want to think through what would make sense and what weaves the story in and how to place things in, and yeah. And I think that's all these tables to me, it's why I prefer those, travel montage or hour by hour where it's just text, because at least it's contextual text. These things to me create jarring
Mhm.
roll results that don't come with the instructions that should be there.
Mhm. Uh, so you have a map and you have put things on the map, and now we're going to talk about surviving on that map with wilderness survival. What does the Dungeon Master's Guide tell us can be there to provide danger other than monsters? Weather. So we get a table for temperature, winds, precipitation, basic rules for extreme cold, extreme heat, wind for precipitation. Later books add something like avalanche, and don't get us started on that, especially Teos, other natural hazards. We talk about high altitudes, some of the hazards in the wilderness, like desecrated ground and frigid water and quicksand and razor vine and slippery ice and thin ice. All good stuff.
Hmm.
All good stuff. All stuff that you can definitely use, in not only travel, but just in general in your adventures. You could have the Lich's Tower being surrounded by Razorvine and so on. Um, we get rules for foraging and becoming lost, and it's all good. I think
Hmm.
this at least is something I can use as the DM. It might help answer a question for me of I'm having a swamp adventure and I want to use quicksand. How do I do that? Oh,
Yep.
here it is.
Mhm.
Anything else about that wilderness survival chapter that caught your eye?
No, I think it's reasonable. There are some pieces that it could do instruction wise to say, remember that a ranger might have favored terrain and just sort of invalidate getting lost, and a number of bits like that that could be
Mhm.
helpful. Foraging, when's the last time foraging came up? It seldom comes up. Why? Because we're usually not running that kind of campaign. So speaking to that probably makes sense a bit, right? Like
Mhm.
foraging works in this type of a campaign. If you want to do that, you'll have to make sure they're
Mhm.
running out of resources so that they are forced to forage, because otherwise nobody's going to forage.
Yeah, it's very true. Uh, again, we talked about this way back in 2020, so you can go back and listen to a more in-depth version of all of this. Next, we get a talk of settlements. A village, town, or city makes an excellent backdrop for an adventure. The adventurers might be called on to track down a criminal who's gone into hiding, solve a murder, blood in Baldur's Gate, take out a gang of were-rats or doppelgangers, or protect a settlement under siege. When creating a settlement for your campaign, focus on locations that are most relevant to the adventure. There's some good that's a good thought.
Hmm.
Don't worry about naming every street and identifying the inhabitants of every building. So with that, we get immediately tables. Who would
Hmm.
have thought? Uh, the tables are, well, they start they start off bad and then get a little better. Because what's the very first thing that this settlement table uh, tells us? What can we roll for? Yes, Teos, we can roll to learn the race relations of a settlement.
Indeed. And by the way, Sean, your camera seems to have faded. Or just yeah, race relations as the first table was just jarring. Like what?
Yeah,
Why am I injecting that into my game without some kind of discussion?
right. Yeah.
And only
Now the
one
rest of
the,
them
the
make
view of the
perfect
world,
sense, and
1 to 10 is harmony. That's
yeah, everything
half the
everything
time
else is about
bad.
oppression. Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
So
no thanks.
obviously, if that is what your campaign wants and your players want to discuss, great. For those of us who want to keep race relations uh, as something that we have to deal with in the real world and don't want it in our fantasy, then this table is obviously not for you unless you always roll a 10 or lower. Uh, but the rest of the charts talk about things that sort of you would expect when you are dealing with a settlement. Who's the ruler? What's the status of the ruler? What are some notable traits? It's got a massive statue or monument. It's a site of many battles, right? Those sorts of things. What is it known for? Rude people, decadence, powerful guilds. Okay, cool. And the current calamity, going from 1 to 20, from suspected vampire infestation to religious sects struggling for power. Uh, so things that, like the other tables, if you know what you want, you don't need the table. The table could spur some good thoughts, but maybe talk a little bit more about each of these things and how they might work well in an adventure. Sort of going back to this theme that we've hit many, many times over this chapter and over this entire book.
I mean, and I think this is like,
Any thoughts there?
yeah, it's a little bit like when you're watching a movie and there's a scene and you're like, well, that's fun, but it doesn't really work with the rest of the movie. And I think that's what the danger of these tables, right? That you'll just chuck in a settlement that they find in the wilderness, and you're going to have this thing about how they're dealing with a plague or whatever, and that's perfectly fine. But if your story is not one where plague really fits, then it feels like it's just a weird episode in the story that just, the plague episode, and it doesn't hit the arc or the theme. And so a little guidance on how to
Mhm,
choose these things would be helpful. The other thing is
mhm,
some stories work for certain sizes of settlements and the amount of time you want to
mhm,
spend there, and some don't. And so you want to tailor these options. You don't need a mysterious anonymous cabal as the ruler when you're just passing through. Like that's too much, right?
mhm.
because you
Right,
don't care.
right.
You need to get out of here, like not, and so that's where it's finding what that cadence should be that I think is really important.
Mhm. Then we get not only random settlement types, but random buildings and tables for the random buildings. It could be a residence, it could be a religious building, it could be a tavern, it could be a warehouse, or it could be a shop. And then there are subtables for each of those particular kinds. Is the residence an orphanage, or a lavish guarded mansion? Is the religious building an abandoned shrine, or a temple to a good or neutral deity? Is the tavern a low-key quiet bar, or a members only club? You want a random tavern name? We got the generator just for you. Quick, Teos, pick a number 1 to 20.
5,
Pick another number 1 to 20.
17.
It is the Prancing Satyr that we are now going to enter.
Lovely. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really fun.
I would
That's
have
great.
liked if you had said 13 for the second one, it would have been the Prancing Horde, which I believe uh, is the name of any dance that my game group does. Uh,
I like that. And I like
but
that
yeah,
some of them,
yeah,
when you read
fun
right
stuff.
across, like the prancing pony, are things
Yeah,
that are actually found in literature or games. Yeah.
yeah, sure.
Um,
Warehouses, anything from abandoned to secret smugglers den, etc. You get the idea.
mhm. Yeah, and I think that one thing that I would have liked here is if they just said, like, they kind of talk about, like, in a chase you need to detail something. Yes, and that's great. For a chase, these kinds of tables are great. But that is a different process than if you're populating this town. Then you're not just going to randomly put something in there. You might want to roll a certain number of buildings out and then construct them in a way, which is, I think, what they then try to get to in the mapping a settlement part.
I think that covers pretty much what we want to talk about today,
Hmm.
because we still have urban encounters, unusual environments, and traps, which probably could each be their own segment, but I think we can
Yeah,
wrap these up next week.
sounds
All
good.
right. In that case, thank you to our listeners. Thank you to our patrons who keep the lights on for us here. If you are a Master of Dungeons supporter, we tip our hat to you, our brimless hat. If you are a Master of Realms supporter, you have our thanks in our show notes every week. And if you are a Master of the Multiverse patron, well, here's a shout out just for you. Keith Amon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King. Sorry I missed you at Origins, Brian. Jim Klingler at AKA DM Prime Mover, Travis Lee, Chad Lench, the Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, the Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Krishna Simone. Say I didn't see you at Origins, but I know you were there. Joe Tyler, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you so much for our patrons. Thank you so much to our listeners. And if you're a listener who likes the show, please do consider supporting us via our Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. And also, if you get a chance, leave us a review on Apple Podcast, or subscribe via YouTube if you want to subscribe to us and see us in all our glory. So, Teos, where can people find you on the internet?
Alphastream.org. I also hang out on Mastodon, begrudgingly on Twitter. Where do we find you, Shawn?
Mm-hmm. Also on Twitter at Sean Merwin. The show itself is on Twitter at Mastering D&D, and the show is on Mastodon at Dice Camp. You can join our community via Patreon to ask your questions there. You also get access to our Discord, where we have many emphatic and enlightening conversations. And you can leave comments for us on the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel on each and every one of our episodes. So, Teos, we've got a show here. We talked about some more adventure environments. What are we going to do now?
Hmm. Well, let's wander into one of those environments and get mauled by owlbears.
You can catch me at the Prancing Horde later today.
If you survive the owlbears.
Of course.